Deanna and I have been chatting for the last 20 minutes before saying, you know what, we really need to hit record. But unfortunately, we'll have to save the topics that we were discussing maybe for another episode and get on with what we're planning to talk about today, which is the cancellation of electronic travel authorizations for Mexican nationals, which we will tie into a broader discussion about when visas can be canceled in general. The Supreme Court granting leave in Pepa, which will briefly summarize the case, and which I think falls under what Deanna and I were talking about, which is what is going on in a lot of our immigration system. And finally, we've been asked to cover, and we will discuss anti-Semitism and Canadian immigration. It's that description doesn't really cover exactly how or
I
what we're
think you
going to
put it
talk about.
well
But
when you said
yeah,
the value-based proposition. And I
yeah,
think that's like because then it's not just about anti-Semitism, it's about all sorts of different things that keep percolating
yeah,
right now.
exactly. So why don't we start with what actually dropped when we recorded with Peter a couple weeks ago for episode 100, which was the cancellation of the Mexican electronic travel authorizations. I know both of us, when we sat down with Peter, we were like, you won't believe what just happened. And what was also interesting about it, and any of our listeners who are on Twitter should follow someone called Ghosts of CIC, who leaked that this was coming. Didn't leak exactly what it was, although hinted at it. And it's an interesting account to follow. So I'm going to pull up the share screen because yesterday the government actually amended the rules, which, as far as also what is going on, I remember when announcements about rule changes used to happen before the rules would change, whereas now it seems like often there's an announcement made and a week later or 2 weeks later, the actual new rules are published in the Gazette. The most extreme example, I had someone during COVID who arrived at a port of entry and a visa officer denied them entry and they wrote down the regulation. And my client sent me the thing with the handwritten regulation. And I looked it up and I said, this regulation doesn't exist. To which my client said, the officer said they know, but they're being told to handwrite this because it's coming soon.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
So
the Mexican visa is a good example because they talked about the fact that it was going to be canceled. Like the first actual announcement was like at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it came into force at 11:30 Eastern time. Is that how it works?
yeah. And
And
then
so
published the regulatory change March 13 for something that came into effect February 26th.
talk
So I
about
don't
rule
know
of
why
law
there are these
issues right
delays.
there.
Yeah, I don't know why there are these delays. But the
No, and I guess the thing is that I understand that they don't want to give people a bunch of lead time, and all of a sudden, like every person who's in a limbo situation gets on a plane in order to get here. But there were literally people in the air who, for
yeah,
the entire period of time that the between the announcement that by the time that they actually arrived at the port of entry, the ETA that they had boarded the plane with was no longer active, and they couldn't have known that on their way to the airport that morning.
yeah, I
So
know the airports were super confused.
yeah.
Um, but so the big thing is that a Mexican citizens now, for the most part, need a visa. The conservatives had imposed one in 2009. The liberals, with great fanfare, removed it in 2015 was a campaign pledge, but it may have actually been in 16. That the visa requirement was lifted, and now it is sort of being reimposed. What's ironic, and I've tweeted about this a whole bunch, is that the conservatives in 2015 in their budget actually wanted to do what the liberals have now done, which is make Mexico get treated essentially the same as Brazil, which is that if you are a citizen of Mexico and you have had a Canadian visa in the past 10 years, which won't be a lot of people because they all had ETAs, or if
Yeah.
you've had a US visa, then you can get an electronic travel authorization. The benefit of an electronic travel authorization is that it takes like a few minutes to complete online and in generally a few minutes to process. Whereas a visa application takes,
Weeks
can
or months.
take a
Yeah.
long time to prepare. And I think they're aiming for a 30-day standard to process. It says here, although they are anticipating that there is going to be a surge in applications.
I think that there's already been postings saying that there are massive delays at the Mexican visa office
Yeah.
because of this transitional period.
And the other thing they did, and there seems to be either information and misinformation or just changes in approach, was when they did this, they said, okay, if you're a work permit holder or a study permit holder, and you currently have those permits, your ETAs are not canceled. Although if we accidentally cancel them, please contact us. But this question has arisen, well, what about their children who are here on visitor records? Initially, it seemed like they wouldn't be able to get ETAs. Then there was a brief period where it seemed like the department had reversed that and said that they could. And from what I understand now, they're again saying, no, no, those people need visas. So what happened was, like, we had clients who had gone to visit their families in Mexico. Parents have work permits, children have visitor records. Family can't come back because the kids now need visas. Bit of a gong show.
Yeah, and so like I think to go like to the basics, this whole thing you need to understand that there are basically three different ways coming into Canada that might apply to you. Either you're from a visa exempt country, let's say you're coming from Australia, then in that case, you only need an ETA. You can, as Steve said, you can make the ETA application in the cab on the way to the airport. You type in a few details, and unless there's like an admissibility issue or something like that, you should have the ETA within minutes, and then you can board your plane. So that's the most permissive rule. And we're talking about countries like, the UK and like most of Europe and, no, actually, I'm not going to talk about the United States because that's more complicated.
Yeah. Well, they're just
Australia,
exempt. Yeah.
exactly. So that is actually, there's four scenarios in that case because the US is just exempt altogether. They don't need either a visa or an ETA. Okay, so ETA only, and then there's the people that require a TRV. That's the kind of most restrictive one where you need to make an application to a visa office in advance, get the visa issued to you. As Steve said, could be weeks or months before you get them, depending on the visa office and their own delays. And then there's this weird hybrid that got created around Brazil. And I can't remember when did the Brazil hybrid situation, because that was
I
the
want to
first
say
one that had like this.
2016, 17 that
So,
Brazil became a hybrid.
okay. And
Similar to the
so,
Philippines was last year, I think.
but I think they added a bunch. It wasn't just the Philippines.
Yeah,
I was
yeah, there
trying,
was I mean it would be in the regs.
yeah, exactly. I was trying to find just now the regulation where they added the countries. I think it's somewhere like section 7 of the regs, but I can't remember for sure. But anyway, so now it's like in certain circumstances you'll need a TRV. In certain circumstances you'll need an ETA. And so again, the overall outcome of this, there being now so many variables, is that it's just very confusing for people to figure out. It's not like a binary yes or no answer. Do I need it? And so for the people in that hybrid group, like Brazil and now the Philippines and now Mexico, I feel like there's lots of confusion about when it's actually required. And also confusion about like, so, okay, now I have an ETA. Does that mean I can make a work permit application at the port of entry? And to me, if you're in one of those hybrid situations like Brazil or Mexico or the Philippines, you cannot make a work permit application at the port of entry. And so I think that little
Yeah, that's
nuance
big.
is big because a lot of people are being told, well, no, you don't need a visa, and so you can come in. But the requirement about who can make an application for a work permit at the port of entry, it says in order to make a work permit at the port of entry, you need to be TRV exempt. And people in this hybrid group are not TRV exempt. They're just in this weird
There's a
hybrid
bunch of
situation.
loopholes for the land border, but yeah, for the most part,
But they are just loopholes, and I think that people don't
Yeah,
realize they're loopholes, and that I think
yeah,
they're being made by mistake, those decisions. So I think you're
yeah,
going to see, and I have seen situations where people have shown up, they were told by their friend that they got their work permit at the port of entry, but I think it can go dreadfully wrong too. So
yeah. I mean, at the land border. It's well. I want to be careful here. On the land border, it's allowed if someone is been in Canada and just gone to the US and back within the period authorized for their stay. So it's a very narrow exception.
super
One of the
narrow.
things, and I just pulled up, it's always interesting when you read government. I'm a bit of a nerd in terms of like liking to read the Gazette, is when they did this announcement. Um, actually, let me go. So here's the Gazette from 2016. So I guess November 2016 is when they lifted the visa requirement for Mexico.
There you go.
And they said they like to produce costs of this. So they said at the time that the government was expected to lose around $40 million per year over 10 years, and that in 2025, the total expected in present value dollars of lifting the visa would be 15.9 million from increased tourism and 35.1 million in terms of costs from increased enforcement costs.
Oh
Now,
my
10 years
goodness.
later, when we're lifting the when we're reimposing it, costs have gone just like way up. It's I don't even know like the numbers when you look at like if we look at 2024, they're saying that reduced tourism spending this year with what was originally projected at I guess 35 15.9 as the benefit is this year now at around 117 million in lost tourism. And this cost of what they anticipated enforcement costs would be at around 35.1 million is somehow around 550 million. And I don't know if that's just there's more asylum claims than they thought, but they are anticipating. And again, keep in mind that I kind of just said how wrong it seemed that they got these figures of the costs and benefits of lifting the visa at the time, that they lifted it in 2016, they are anticipating that uh, the re-imposition of a visa will essentially save something like $5.5 billion, just because of very high costs of enforcement. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I, I find this very, I'm glad that you actually do this nerdy stuff, because I don't think most people actually look to the to this what is it called, the
is that
yeah, but when they do the cost benefit analysis, they have a specific thing for it. But anyways, I think the other part of this though is that when they talk about the refusal, I mean, so the key driver to doing this was the uptick in bogus refugee claims. I mean, it wasn't necessarily put in quite those terms, but this caused me to look up the IRB's rates on decision making for Mexico, and I can send you that screenshot as well, Steve, too. But like, yes, the number of claims is very high. And so, but at the same time, over the course of 2023, their reported statistics were that 2,894 were allowed and 2,424 were declined. And so I understand that there is an enforcement issue here, but there's also a genuine refugee claim. Like these aren't bogus claims,
yeah.
more
Well,
than
I
half of
posted
the ones that were hurt
our
got
old guest
extended.
Sean Rehag posted this showing like the recognition rate is actually going up
Mm-hmm.
and has crossed 50%.
Yeah, it has crossed 50%. That's exactly my point. This is a much better pictorial to explain it. So yes, I understand that we're talking about, there might be costs to enforcement. However, I feel like there's some scapegoating going on here too. And that, at what cost, like at what societal cost is it that you would then foreclose that avenue to this group of claimants who have genuine claims that are found to be meritorious, who now can't get here to make them. And so I think it's more than just looking at a dollar and cents evaluation of what does it cost to remove those who are not meritorious. And like the fact that these people then that have genuine meritorious claims will, I don't know, be stuck.
Yeah, I don't know. It's well, and I mean, and it's one of those things also where even if the claims, I mean, I think that it's not a question of whether the claims were meritorious. I think the government likes to present it that way, but I think
For
it's
sure.
obviously just that there were a lot of them.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, yeah, so that's sort of where things stand now in terms of the reimposition of the visa requirement on Mexico. It's definitely going to cause short-term headaches. The minister has also hinted that there may be other countries that will have this imposed, but that was just something that he said in the media. It's not
Hmm.
clear.
I
It's not clear
wonder
how
who
far
that would
along
even be.
any of that is.
The last
Um,
time they did this, they did it at the same time as they did Czech Republic and what was it? Hungary, wasn't it? That they
Hungary.
did all three all at the same time.
It's hard to
Um,
see them doing it to the EU countries.
yeah,
And I don't know, be pure speculation to try to guess what he's
totally.
referring to. I don't even know if
Yeah.
he's aware of what he's referring to. Um, the, but I've never seen a mass cancellation of ETAs before. Like, I
Mm.
think this is also a first where there was a bulk cancellation of ETAs, let alone visas
Hmm.
or anything else. So that's also noteworthy. Just it shows sort of a willingness to do this. The previous conservative government had a willingness to cancel application streams, the federal skilled worker class, the federal investor, and this is, now a willingness on this government to cancel existing permits to travel to Canada, essentially.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, doing so also without any regard for like procedural fairness, without any advance warning so that people, as I said, in these absurd situations were in the air when they became non-compliant with the regulations at their arrival to the port of entry. Like there wasn't any physical way for them to anticipate and plan
Yeah,
accordingly. So and who had gone on vacation and then couldn't be reunited with their family without, now facing a big delay in getting the travel document that they require. So yes, the regulations are drafted in such a way that while there are procedural fairness requirements in place, if you're going to cancel a TRV, and I'm actually looking to, if you see there's clear policy that if they're going to cancel a visa, they need to notify you and give you an opportunity and that sort of thing in their own manuals. But I
yeah.
guess
So I just
because it's
pulled that up
yeah, so
when
you've
a
got the same
TRV
thing. I
can
was
be
just going to send
canceled.
that
Yeah.
to you. Yeah. And they're talking about, there being grounds and then there needs to be an opportunity to respond, that sort of thing. But in a situation where you're talking about a cancellation of an ETA, and I just had before me the actual policy, it actually is set up like that in the regulations
Yeah,
so
it's
that
much
at the
easier to cancel
discretion,
ETAs. And it's going to
100%.
become easier. There's also in the Gazette upcoming changes to automatically cancel visas and ETAs when removal orders are made, which kind of makes sense. Like, I mean, there is a logic to
Mm-hmm.
that if somebody's now been removed from Canada and is inadmissible,
Yeah.
to just automatically cancel the visa. There's this gray area. I don't know how often you've dealt with this in terms of um, where somebody has, say, got a temporary resident visa, they come to Canada, they have an issue with CBSA, and then CBSA denying them entry, kind of what happens from there.
Yeah.
CBSA doesn't have the ability to cancel visas. Here's kind of the procedure that Deanna was setting out is that IRCC is supposed to contact them, let them know that there are concerns. Um, I have seen situations and have challenged situations where there's just an automatic refusal and no procedural fairness. I've also seen the very annoying situation where CBSA doesn't cancel the visa. They just draw a line through it and write
Yeah.
void, which is
Yeah.
de facto canceling the visa because no airport is going to, when some guys walk into the airport and says, "Where's your visa?" and they present it, and there's a big line going through it that says void. Um, you
The
know,
fact that that might not be a legally sound
yeah,
decision is not going to, well, okay, so this raises two things. Number one is that we've talked about this before, but the growing bandwidth of airline officials from foreign countries without any authority vested on them by the Canadian government to make determinations as to whether or not somebody is eligible. So when this thing was announced at 8 o'clock in the morning, we had clients that in foreign airports were being told that they weren't allowed to board the plane, even though the policy wasn't even in effect, even aside from what Steve has noted as being the gap between when it was announced and when the actual regulation or when the actual policy was published. That they were being told that because by the time they arrived, their visas were not going to be, or their ETAs were not going to be valid, that they wouldn't board them. And
mm,
again, I really shudder to think about the fact that we've got airline officials from countries that outside of Canada, no affiliation to our immigration
yeah.
determination system, having a say in whether or not somebody can board a plane.
Well, I had a client with a ticket agent at Jakarta who said, I don't care what your lawyer says. I don't care what Canadian immigration officials say. I care what my supervisor says, and my supervisor is saying no. Which, fair
Yeah,
enough. If I was that airline ticket agent and I had to choose between listening to a visa official or my boss, I would choose my boss. Like it's,
yeah, for sure. But also, like,
yeah.
are they going to sit and take the time to call the embassy and say,
No,
can
and
you
it's an
please
issue. They
interpret
can
this
call
policy?
CBSA. There is a liaison number that they do call. But then the problem that you run into is it's like a game of telephone where your
Yeah.
client says something to the ticket agent, who says something to the supervisor, who says something to the person who calls the liaison office, who then speaks to CBSA. And it's this, yeah, game of telephone back and forth.
Or it's like our boarding is about to close and we don't yet have a
Right?
clear answer. So this is the
Right?
other thing that actually happens. And
Yeah.
I mean, to answer your question, Steve, I have seen lots of those weird situations where, like, for example, somebody being told that they can't come in, but that their visa is still good and they can come back when they get a new work permit approval letter. And then it turns out that they have been canceled. So they're actually misled at the port of
Mm,
entry, and then they only realize that they have a problem when they try and re-enter. And I've seen this a lot with people who are applying um, in the International Experience Canada. And so they then try to come back and they're told, no, 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 that invite letter is expired or we can't use it anymore. So it's not exactly the same issue
yeah.
as a visa, but still it's these kinds of determinations. They can get really muddied when they're being made at the spur of the moment on the spot without any submissions and I think just to make people, I think our objective here is to make people alive and sensitive to the fact that if they're in one of these hybrid situations, the idea of just making a run at the border can be very, very, if they determine that you've come there without the necessary travel documents, there can be real consequences.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation.
Yeah.
Um, let's move on to Pepa. Her situation is it just reminds me of Mason in terms of like what is the government arguing? So the basic issue here is that a permanent someone with a permanent resident visa who arrives at a port of entry and is found inadmissible can appeal their removal order and inadmissibility to the Immigration Appeal Division. Seems straightforward enough. What has happened is
All
that
right.
just due to scheduling and delays, by the time they get to the appeal stage or the removal order stage, their visa is expired. So, for example, and these dates aren't accurate, but just the example, Dorinella has a permanent resident visa that expires September 1. She arrives August 1. CBSA determines that she may have committed misrepresentation. So they write her up. Her immigration division hearing isn't until September 15. So by that point, it has passed through circumstances beyond her control. And then the Immigration Appeal Division says, well, you have no appeal because at the time that you were found inadmissible, your visa was now expired. So this is going up to the Supreme Court. Once again, it's Erica and Molly from Edelman, who I think also argued Mason as well as a bunch of other cases. And yeah, it's just like,
Yeah. What are you
really?
doing? Yeah,
Like
I
what?
know.
How
So,
can
and the
that be
issue is that
oh,
they're declining jurisdiction. They're saying that she is not a person with like she's not a member of the family class, say,
yeah.
for
I
example, or
mean, the
whatever.
analogy that I would make would be like, imagine that you get a parking ticket and it says, instead of saying you have 10 days to appeal, it says we need to read your appeal within 10 days. And
Mm-hmm.
people appeal on day one, and then they get told by ImPark or Easy Park, oh, sorry, we didn't read it till the 15th, so no appeal. That's
Mm-hmm.
basically the analogy that I would draw here. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you
I
know,
had a similar case many, many years ago. Actually, I think it was my first appearance in federal court, where it was a similar type of a situation on restoration of status, where they said if it took Vegreville, which is where it was at the time, if it took them 6 months to deny the restoration application because of like submitting the incorrect fee, she no longer had any more days to file for restoration of status. And that was only a
oh,
product of the fact that um, that you know that they had delayed so long and adjudicating that case.
I
And
think I've read
so
that. Is that where it starts with an S, where like, was it that they refused the extension, but then sat on it for like 2 months or something before they mailed it? Or is that a different case?
no, I think it might be different. But again, I've argued this in various different ways. I understand the DOJ hates this precedent, but it basically said it was a really wonderful decision, I thought, from Mr. Justice von Finkenstein. When he said something like rationality and common sense have not completely left the room. And so I remember he walked
Completely
into
left the room.
yeah, it
Yeah.
was very funny. He said, the guide makes no sense. It was a restoration application. So like applying on day 4 of the 90-day restoration period, but having a small defect, like you paid 200 rather than 250,
Mm,
and they deny it after 6 months. Now you're done. Like if they had denied it in 3 days, you could have just reapplied with the right fee. But it's
right, right,
their
right.
delay that caused her to have no alternative. So we basically said that the restoration period should not, like it should be frozen for that period of time, that the application is in their hands.
Yeah, yeah, that makes
And the department agreed. Now try applying that again because they don't like it. but but it seems to me the same principle should apply in Pepa because like that's on you. That delay is on you, and the statutory time limit can't possibly be seen to run when the applicant has totally clean hands and it's the department's unjustified delay that is causing the statutory right to expire.
yeah, yeah. So I hope they win.
Oh, my
Between
goodness,
this and
me too.
Mason, it feels like the Supreme Court is playing a pivotal role in, yeah, just
I
and
feel like
Tran. Like there's a lot of immigration decisions that and Wong that have really kept immigration law from going in a very unfair to the individual direction.
mhm,
Mason especially. But so we'll see where Pepa goes. Obviously, our thoughts on it are clear.
yeah.
But yeah,
There are a few others, though, that I think are making or that we're trying to find an ascent up to the Supreme Court of Canada. I mean, we've talked. I think we rarely have an episode now where we don't talk about the Lee decision, but issues like that, where these principles that are like, really, is that really what you're saying? Um, I would really love to see also some common sense decision making around organized criminality as well, and that's something that I've been calling for. So I would love to see
yeah,
decisions on both of those go all the way up to the top court, because that's the only place I can imagine them being uh,
yeah. We'll have to do an
redirected.
episode on organized crime,
Yeah,
also called two or more people committing a crime. Or is
Yeah,
it three? Three or
exactly.
more people committing a crime, not
No matter how
not the
disorganized the individual.
conventional not the conventional definition that I think people, or
No.
the colloquial definition that people think of.
Yeah. You can be talking about three homeless people, committing crimes of poverty in concert with one another, and suddenly they're an organized criminal group within the meaning of the act. I mean, this is the kind of state of absurdity we seem
Yep.
to be moving our way
It
towards.
encompasses that up to the mafia, but most of the cases involving the disorganized group, it seems.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and okay, here we go. The Our favorite topic. We've been asked to, so following the Gaza episode that we did, I received some feedback on it. And one of the things I was recently asked to talk about lately was actually not so much the immigration component, but more just what Deanna and I thought about what seems to be the lack of um, not authoritarian, but response from the authorities, which I guess is authoritarian, to the response from authorities to some of the protests involving Gaza. And at the same time, I've listened to another podcast where the host rhetorically asked, like, what does Canada gain by allowing people who may be anti-Semitic into the country? And one friend asked, kind of interesting, and I did think about it for a bit, was like, because I had said that I didn't think that any of the individuals who would be arriving under the Gaza program, which as a side note, it seems is no one, because no one has been able to travel to Canada yet under this program. But I had said that I thought it was very unlikely that any of them would engage in violence, regardless of what their views may be. And someone said, well, what level of anti-Semitism do you think is acceptable in people? Which was a question I put some thought to. So that's kind of teeing the segment up. I don't know if
Mhm.
there's any additional teeing that you want to do.
Well, I'm thinking, like, for me, it's more, we started this conversation a little bit on the prior episode, but just talking about values-based decision making, because if you're going to talk about what degree of anti-Semitism is sufficient, then I think you're having to talk about just looking at people's views,
Hmm.
not about their actions, but their views. And this is the thing that I kind of went off about in our last episode, is like, who is going to be the arbiter of what this what is an acceptable view and what is it sort of reminisces, it's reminiscent to me of some of the conversation we've had in the past around what are Canadian values. We talked about this a whole bunch under the barbaric cultural practices, and there was a lot of backlash against that because there's an inherent racism to me to talking about like what are Canadian values and which ones are considered un-Canadian, especially when it's like done in this very generalized kind of a way and without some very clear, salient first principles conversation
Hmm.
about what is a value proposition. And so I think that that's where it gets so incredibly murky. So it's one thing, should we be in this arena at all, testing people's values in the Canadian immigration system? And secondly, if we are, what is the standard? What is the standard of an acceptable value and an unacceptable value? What we're seeing, like dividing the bar like crazy, is that nobody can even agree on what is anti-Semitism. Is this anti-Semitism or is this just anti-genocide? I don't know, and so it's even amongst our own group of colleagues, we can't come to any consensus about that. What part does the Canadian government wish to have, and how would they do it in an informed way to say this is over the line and this is still okay? It's that this is what I expressed in the last episode, the idea of setting up visa officers, ID members, IAD members, members of the court to assess, are you inside or outside of Canadian values? to me, this is not what we're supposed to be adjudicating in these types of cases.
Yeah, I
Actions, yes.
totally agree.
Values, no.
No, I totally agree. And especially like, okay, so let's say there's a test for anti-Semitism. What like is you've opened the door now to, okay, what about is there going to be a test on transgender rights, a
Mm-hmm.
value around climate change, a value around the Kurdish people, and
Mm-hmm.
who do you want to be in, you can't always assume that the people that you want to be writing those tests will be the people who write those tests, depending
Oh
on
my
an
goodness.
election. Um, and it is kind of, I was thinking this morning about this, like in terms of and so just also the anti-Semitism, like promoting it, screaming it, physically doing it is already a crime in Canada. And there's kind of this trend that I've noticed, and there's two sort of parts to this, which is, and I think the part like, and I understand where people are coming from in terms of concerns about anti-Semitism. Like you, I think there's a bit of conflating in a lot of instances of anti-Semitism and anti how Israel's conducting the war.
100%.
Right? But I'm also prepared to be like, okay, it's reasonable to think that like, I mean, I'll just trust that when they say that there's a big rise in anti-Semitism, and I've seen this stuff like on social media, like, there are there's definitely problematic things happening for sure. And there also, I agree with people that there doesn't seem to be a response. I still think that that is separate from, well, so on that not being a response, I don't think that is limited to this issue. Like whether it was the truckers in Ottawa where the police seemed to not respond. I don't know more before that. This issue now, I'm sure there are other issues where the police, there just seems to be a lack on the part of government to address the situation, which is leading to people to then say, well, let's keep people out. And I would extend this beyond this current issue, right? Like the Lee decision that you referenced. You read the reports just recently about the Winnipeg lab leak, and spies somehow getting top clearance, being removed from Canada, or at least those positions, and then the government actually fighting to cover it up. And it almost seems like there's this response from certain sections within the immigration department that's like, well, if they're not able to deal with this in Canada, we'll just keep everyone out.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think that, like, you know, I obviously think having a robust immigration system is important for Canada. I believe that, if Canada can't accommodate 1,000 Gazans, a country of like 40 million people, can't accommodate 1,000 Gazans, then like, what does that say?
Yeah.
But the lack of action, like it is, and on housing, right? Like there's the inability to deal with housing is leading to a keep people out. So I do think that like the government just needs to do more. I just want to add that I don't like when some of the stuff that I've seen, like, especially like I understand um, why people are protesting. And I understand why they are passionately protesting. If I had family in Gaza, right, like I would be protesting in every way that I could if I thought that I could bring that to an end. I would be pushing the envelope in terms of uh, trying to get attention to the cause as much as I can. It's this, but in the same way that like we don't let the families of the victims of crime, like I wouldn't blame them for wanting, vengeance. The system isn't designed, like the government needs to decide what it determines acceptable and to respond to it beyond just tweeting,
Yeah.
which is what it
Well, this
seems like
is,
is going on.
yeah, I've never been like this massive proponent for free expression and that kind of American, like whatever I say is allowed, whether it's hate speech or not. I am not in that camp. At the same time, what's going on in the world right now has people feeling extremely upset, extremely anxious, traumatized, And so, as you say, Steve, like for these things to then become a public expression where people are getting together and, gathering and expressing their views about this, provided that it's not done in a violent way, that they're not actually meeting the threshold for what is criminal conduct in Canada, I am not in favor of the idea of saying that that's something that needs to be deterred even. And I'm also just not at all happy with the concept that any of these determinations are going to be made as a pre-screening type of process, even outside of any behavior. And that's the sort of thing that we're seeing with the Lee decision. Like, it's not that you actually have done anything to indicate that you are guilty of espionage. It's the mere potential that you could. And I think that anything that would empower that to go beyond somebody's activity, to look at their views, to me is just a system gone crazy. I don't think, I hope Lev will forgive me for quoting what he said on LinkedIn. I think he probably will, but
I think he'll say, have me
well.
back on the podcast.
Yes, he will. We're going to do that anyways. But he said, we have to stop the banal and frankly stupid conflation of concerns with respect to immigration policy equaling racism, and have an honest, first principles driven discussion. Our immigration system is broken. We have long ago foregone the idea of nation building, community, and cohesion. The current system is primarily driven by short-term economic considerations. Quotas are met no matter the cost. An infinite number of streams without an underlying and overarching principle. A Kafkaesque matrix devoid of any reflexivity or humanity, whose interactions with other subsets, be it housing, infrastructure, healthcare, education, is almost exclusively by way of scandal and post-fact adjustment. And really, I think that this is something that we've been kind of beating the drum about so much, is that where's the cohesion? Like, what is the principle behind all of this? I know that it's a lot of like, stay out unless you're good for our economy. That is very, very clear. But on what grounds? And on what grounds? And the other part of this is, I think that and this is something that I keep kind of plugging away at when we talk about criminal inadmissibility and organized crime and all of this stuff, when we're talking about homegrown discontent, dysfunction, anger, why don't we accept any responsibility for that? It's like, you might have been a permanent resident for ages, but now that you've committed this, now, even if you've been here since you were a child, we want you out. Without any rights of appeal, without any consideration of your attachment to Canada, without any consideration of where did these views that you have come from? Did you get them while living here because of persecution you faced? Not persecution, but because of hardship and troubles that you faced here in Canada, or because even of the immigration system and how impactful that was on you? None of that is being discussed. It's just like, you're out, no discussion, and no appeal. And so we began talking about the slippery slope way back when we went from regulations with public debate and, submissions to Parliament and witnesses and all of that, to ministerial instruction. It's the same thing we're talking about all the time, about the attrition of public engagement and public debate on these, and just whimsical lawmaking by ministerial instruction or ETA policies. Like, everything is just made easier to change, enforce. And for me, it means that it's an overly politicized system.
I mean, I've commented before on where are the politicians. Unfortunately, and I should caveat this by saying everything I know about this law, I've read in the media, so it may or may not be accurate, but we've been discussing the whole notion of pre-crime. And where are the politicians on this? And from what I understand, there's a human rights bill that provides for the issuance of a peace bond if someone may engage in hate speech. And people are raising, pre-crime in that context as well. So maybe my optimism that the politicians, how they would actually respond may be misplaced. But that is a very good quote from Lev.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think that you're getting this strictly from the media, Steve. I think that it's decisions like the Lee decision that really, this is actually now infiltrated not just into the media, but all the way into federal court decisions where pre-crime is a thing. And so yeah, I think that's it. So it's not an uninformed opinion, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So yeah, I hope we've answered the other so when I said that actually yeah, I hope that we've addressed that question. If anyone else has other questions they want us to discuss on the podcast, we're hoping to do, little shorter segments
Mm-hmm,
sometimes where we do discuss this.
mm-hmm.
But yeah, I hope and I'm sure we'll get feedback on this.
Oh
And we'll
yeah,
have to have Lev on. That is we should email Lev.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
awesome.
Okay.
Okay.